Almost there.
Can I, just on the annual report piece,
Love
if it's
you to
okay?
jump in.
We will have a copy available if people wanted to come up and see it. I don't know that we are like printing them at Hall Printing, to hand
okay.
them out. They're
Gotcha.
available online. You could go.
Fairly expensive. We won't have hundreds.
Just trying to keep the cost down.
Of course, which is
Which
also our
the
job.
fact
The
that we-
fiduciary responsibility is
Yeah.
key.
The fact that we do it all in-house too, and we don't contract, like a lot of municipalities contract out to some publisher to do them all. We do them all internally in-house with, getting our communications team. And I should mention Amy Mooney as well does quite a bit of work on it. So just keeping that done in-house saves a lot of money.
Great.
So as far as community engagement, you're telling me that we're ready to go? Well, I'm just interested, are there ways where we could distribute a copy to certain organizations around town? So it would be accessible to different demographics that, as I say, may not have that digital access that we often take for granted.
Yeah, well, the library always gets a copy.
Perfect.
So they have one from every year. You could go and look at them all if you wanted to. So that's
So
a
if
great place
you
to go and check it out.
Don't want to come to the second floor of
Yeah.
City Hall, just go over to the library. And when do we know, will they be available? I saw
They should be available.
printed.
Printed? Yeah,
Oh, okay.
pretty quick, eh?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I checked last week and they
Okay.
said they were at the printer maybe, but I didn't know when they were
Yeah.
coming back. Awesome. Okay. And are we going through everything again? Adoption, can we just jump to
It's a whole new agenda.
adoption of the agenda? Seems redundant to,
It's a different meeting.
yeah, okay. Are there any late items for this particular meeting?
I think we have to,
She's doing.
Now we're having issues with the, let me just see if I can get in there. From here. I do. Sebastian, can you look on the TV? It should be on that laptop.
The one with the new password.
Yeah, I think so.
My stickers
Thank you.
and
This thing?
You got the one for us.
I got it from Doors. It's got stacks of them.
Oh, nice.
So cute.
Yeah. Kubulas are cute.
Is that it? No?
I didn't get recall.
Talk about Kamloops.
No, it's.
Hot mess.
So are we online, Sarah?
We're live, but we're just waiting.
We are live and online, coming to you from downtown City of Nelson. Is there anything else council would like to share with the residents of our fair town right now?
nope.
As we experience some technical difficulties. I did nothing to cause this. I just changed seats
We need one of those old
temporarily.
school cable television things that popped
Yeah.
up and just said, please stand by.
Please stand by. Because you won't want to miss what's coming up next.
Does she have one, Chris?
Well, there's this one here, we can try.
I think we should try it.
Yeah. Do you wanna try that? Okay. It's just trying one right now, is that? Yeah. Okay.
I could do a couple of public service announcements.
Did we adopt, we could adopt the agenda?
We could. That's
Let's
what
do that,
I'm
yeah.
asking if we, okay. So we've called the meeting to order.
Okay, perfect.
And can we adopt the agenda? Moved by Councillor Page, seconded by Councillor Woodward. All those in favor? Good with the agenda. I did ask for late items. Nothing was raised. There's no previous meeting minutes, and we have Development Services here to do a workshop around short-term rentals. Are we technologically able to show
There we
the
go.
show.
All right.
Woohoo!
Good time.
Okay.
Success.
So, am I reading something on this one? Oh, nope. It's just over to you. It's a workshop. You're going to tell us what we need to know. And more.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, I'd like to do kind of an overarching run-through of our short-term rental regulations within the City of Nelson. We have a few new council members, so I'd just like to give everybody a quick run-through. You know, the short-term rental regulations in the City of Nelson are pretty complicated and nuanced, and it's great for everyone to have a bit more of a foundational understanding of how these work and how they impact our city. So for short-term rentals. So what is exactly a short-term rental? So these are homes, suites, and rooms in a residential area in the city. So one of our residential neighborhoods, and that's for rent to the public. And the short part of short-term rental is less than 31 days. So short-term stays of less than a month at a time. And these are, a commercial use. So rental, there's, it's a commercial use, there's an exchange of money, and that's occurring in a residential zone. So it's a commercial use in a residential zone. And these are being regulated by a number of bylaws, including the business license bylaw, the parking bylaw, and our zoning bylaw. And typically they can look like a lot of different things, but typically they do look like a basement suite, similar to this, standard living area. And then these are rented out on a short-term basis. And then you'd probably see them on Airbnb and a variety of different rental platforms. And then kind of the flip side of that, another shorter term rental application is tourist accommodation, which is also a commercial use. And this is also when buildings or rooms are rented for accommodation to the public, and that's, again, 30 days or less. And typically these are occurring in a commercial mixed-use zone, usually in association with, or in addition to some kind of commercial use, like retail or restaurants. So these are operating as a commercial use, similar to short-term rentals. These are operating within a commercial zone of the city or a mixed-use zone of the city. So these are a short-term rental that you're seeing in the downtown core. And these are operated and regulated similarly through the same bylaws, the business license bylaw, the parking and zoning bylaws. So they can look very similar, they can look very different to short-term rentals. We can see here in this building that is a heritage home. It was converted. We have a tattoo shop, a commercial use, and then on the upper floor we have a residential rental, which you can see in the images here. It looks very similar to what we saw in the residential zone. So they can look similar. They share a lot of the same amenities, but this is occurring in a commercial zone of the city, so within our downtown. So similar type of function, but they are regulated slightly differently. So putting these together, we can see short-term rentals on the left. We're in residential zones, but we do require a residential or a principal residential use of the property in order for that to comply with zoning. So again, it's a commercial use in a residential area, so there needs to be still a residential use is the dominant use. So there still needs to be a long-term resident on the property. And then for short-term rentals, we do have, they need to get a business license, so there are caps to those licenses. And those come in 3 forms of annual licenses, 4-month and 31-day periods, which I can get into a bit later. And then tourist accommodation, again, in our downtown mixed-use zones, and those do not require a principal resident because that is a compliant use with the zoning already. And then there are no license caps for tourist accommodations. And then there are some similarities there. So they are both business, commercial uses. They both need business licenses. They are both shorter term housing for the public, and they both require a number of regulations like inspections and parking, etc. So looking at some of the trends that we're seeing for short-term rentals in Nelson, this graph can be a little bit complicated, but we do have the 3 types of units that we see that you can rent out, and then we have the 3 types of licenses on the right side. So you can rent out a room, a suite, or a home, and then we have annual licenses, 4-month licenses, and 31-day licenses. And then each of the colors is broken down over the past 5 years. So we look at the light blue bar for 2023. We can see that suites are very popular as they have been. And homes and rooms are relatively stable. And we also see in the light blue bar for 2023 that annual licenses are clearly the highest popularity compared to 4-month and 31-day licenses. So those annual licenses provide a lot of flexibility for property owners. It allows them to rent out their unit throughout the year, gives them a bit more flexibility with when they rent it, when they're going on a trip, for example. So people do appreciate that flexibility. And then comparing it to what our caps are, so these are the real numbers of how many licenses we've issued each year. So we can see just over here we have 80 annual licenses out of our cap of 110 annual licenses. And of the total cap for all of the license types, we have a cap of 150. So we have a cap of 110 annual licenses and 40 4-month licenses, so 150. And of that total cap for licenses, we're at 106 as of 2023. So that's kind of the capacity that we're looking at. That's how much is currently being used. So looking a bit deeper at what these rentals actually mean for housing in Nelson, we can look at the number of homes and suites and building permits that are actually being used for short-term rental. So currently in 2023, we have 32 homes that are being used and operated as short-term rental. So those are homes and condos, and then 50 of the basement suites or secondary suites are being operated as a short-term rental as well. So if we go back and we have a look at this kind of growth projection that we're seeing in this graph, based on, and we're looking at that 106 out of 150. If we continue similar growth patterns and development patterns, and then we see growing travel demand or on-track travel demand, we'd be looking at meeting those license caps maybe by 2028, approximately. So that's what could be expected. And then we can also look into building permits that Development Services has issued and compare the housing stock that's being created and developed, and then what proportion of that is being allocated to short-term rental or converted to a shorter-term rental type of use. So in 2021, we had 36 building permits that were issued for secondary suites, and 8 of those are being used as short-term rental today. And in 2022, we issued 30 building permits for suites, and 4 of those are being used for short-term rental today. And so that gives a good idea of the proportion that we're seeing. It's not exact, but we can get a general idea of the allocation to longer-term rental and the allocation towards short-term rental. And we also see just anecdotally that these short-term rentals are being very helpful for property owners as mortgage helpers. It's very appealing to people to have this supplementary income to help pay for their mortgage with housing prices going the way they're going. This is a great opportunity for people to help pay for that mortgage. So that's anecdotally what we see. So tracking these short-term rentals, we do a weekly review of any new listings with a software called Host Compliance, where we identify any new listings, ensure that they have a business license. If they don't, we begin communication with that property owner. Enforcement takes place if necessary. And ultimately, the applicant applies for a license to operate the short-term rental, or if, for example, if they need to bring a suite up to the modern building code, then they'll get a building permit to do that. And also looking into just a general question that I see floating around is, why do we see approximately 200 listings on Airbnb within the Nelson area, which is a very reasonable question. So going back to that graph here, we can see that, okay, we have about 80 annual licenses, we have about 25 4-month licenses, say about 100 active licenses or so. So that 200 listings is broken down by those licensed rentals that are licensed by the city, and then also rentals that are just outside city limits. So it doesn't show an exact address when you look at Airbnb. It shows a general 1 kilometer radius of where that rental is. So we do get plenty advertised that are just outside the city. We also have long-term rentals that we see on Airbnb. It's perfectly legal to rent out your Airbnb or to rent out your unit on Airbnb for longer than 31 days without a business license. That's acceptable. And we also see tourist accommodation as well. So all of those tourist accommodations, all of those listings, you'll see those on Airbnb often as well. So that's kind of the breakdown of what that 200 number actually looks like. But a large chunk of that is licensed rentals by the city. And just one other note on tracking short-term rentals. The province is currently doing some engagement with communities on what their potential role could look like on maybe taking over some of the enforcement or identification responsibilities from municipalities. Maybe that looks like helping to identify listings that don't have a business license, or maybe it is a role potentially looking at enforcement or something like that, somehow to help the management of short-term rentals by cities be a bit more consistent across the board. So that hasn't been fleshed out fully. They're still in the early stages of engagement, but they're hoping to have that more solidified by the end of the year. So just taking a step back here, the regulations from short-term rentals came from the public. So the public came to the city when some of these platforms were becoming bigger, that they wanted to operate these short-term rentals and they wanted this supplementary income. So council directed staff to ultimately look into regulating them, and Nelson does have some of the most stringent and most, I guess, well-respected regulations for short-term rentals. We have a lot of conversations with other municipalities on how we manage things. So generally for recommendations, just observing how these regulations continue to work over time. It seems like the current license caps are appropriate for the demand that we're seeing. We don't have a lineup of people getting licenses, and we don't have a vast number of vacant licenses either. It seems that we have struck something of a balance there. It's also recommended to just wait and see what potential role the province could play in enforcement and tracking short-term rentals. And also staff could potentially explore capping tourist accommodation licenses as well. So those are a typical business license like any hotel, but that can just be any other residential unit in the downtown core. That could be a tourist accommodation as well. So there are some high-level policies in Nelson's guided documents to encourage new housing in Nelson's downtown. So there could be some conflict there between tourist accommodations, new residential units in the downtown core being built and immediately being used as tourist accommodation. There could be some conflict there. So there could be some potential for regulation of those licenses. And that is the general breakdown of short-term rentals.
Okay, questions? Thank you for the report. Lots of interesting information. Councillor Woodward.
Thank you. So I'm interested with this exploring the capping, the tourist accommodations, especially like the downtown, because my memory serves me correctly, there used to be a lot of relatively affordable housing, like on top of buildings on Baker Street, and a lot of those have been turned to Airbnbs. So I'm just wondering, I think we probably have lost a fair amount of affordable rental. People have converted them. But I also know that there is, if we just said, as Councilor Pinero said, like we're not doing Airbnb anymore or something like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that the people who own those suites would want to have long-term rentals. I would imagine people also choose to have short-term rental because it fits their lifestyle or fits what they need. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that it's not necessarily always a choice between long-term rental and short-term rental. There are definitely different requirements for managing those two different types of rentals, and people have historically come across different conflicts with each of those, so it seems to be what is more what fits their lifestyle better, I suppose. So I would say that's accurate.
So, supplemental? So, I guess if it is really up to the owners of the properties to decide what they want to do, and then we have our choice around enforcement. And as you were saying, we have fairly stringent enforcement and capping, which I think is vital in considering our town is so tourist-driven. But I do understand that we have probably lost a chunk of rental property that would have been on the market to this process over the last, I don't know, bunch of years. Would you say that's a fair assessment, or do you feel like we have enough controls with what we're doing?
Yeah, it definitely is ultimately up to the property owner to decide whether or not doing a tourist accommodation in a building on Baker is feasible. It's a permitted use, so it's kind of, as long as they bring the unit up to building code, and they have the other regulations set in place, there isn't a lot of hurdles for them to jump through. The licenses are quite accessible. So in that sense, there have been some units that have been lost, that have been converted into tourist accommodation and are now operating on a short-term basis. So whether or not that has been filled by new housing, that demand, or not is difficult to say precisely.
Thank you.
Councillor Page?
I might have a few questions, so bear with me. Sebastian got some of it. I wanted to spread out some of the love. Even though I was talking to you about the annual report based on pages that we're in. So by my numbers, we're looking at about 2% of our building stock or units based on the 4,300 homes we have, based on the 100 units that are currently being used in some capacity as a short-term rental, recognizing, of course, that if someone rents it for 4 months, you're certainly not going to have someone there for a full year rolling into a long-term situation. So it's effectively removing that long-term opportunity. We heard you speak a little bit about the support around paying for the current mortgages that are required in an environment, both nationally, provincially, of elevated, inflated housing costs. I don't think anyone would disagree that Canada is currently sitting in a situation of absolute outrageous housing inflation costs. So do we understand as more of these units that are coming online are going towards short-term rental than the standing stock? What impact on that housing inflation component and that cost component for our housing is being driven by these opportunities to commodify the portion of the residential market? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, I suppose. We aren't seeing clearly all of our new units being driven towards this shorter term use. It definitely, again, is that balance between what's more appropriate for people's lifestyles, and a lot of that is still driven towards short-term rental. So, yeah, in terms of what we're seeing right now, the license caps are appropriate for the level of growth that we're seeing, the level of development that we're seeing, and they suit the projections for housing that we're going to need over the next 20 years.
Can we go to Councillor Taylor?
Yeah, go.
Hi, thanks for the report. Thanks for distilling all this information, because there's a lot of questions that people always have about how many are this or how many are that. Has this been brought to our business community and our employers, hoteliers and such, and have they given you any feedback on the impact that short-term rentals have on their business? Because if we don't have long-term numbers, but based on this slide where 8 of the new BP building permits, thanks, 8 of the 36, which is 22%, or 4 of the 30, which is 13%. So that's higher than the 2% of the total stock. So you're getting any feedback on the impact on our employers and hoteliers in the city?
Yeah, I think some engagement in the future would definitely be appropriate to, if we were looking to, if council saw it appropriate to consider relaxing or restricting those caps a bit further, then I think it would be appropriate to do some engagement with the business community and with some residents as well. But yeah.
Maybe just a supplemental. I think there's been a few iterations, but I would say the bylaw as it stands today is probably a bit more than 5 years old. So yeah, it could be a good time to chat about it. I think this conversation is going to be coming up through the OCP process around housing and what that looks like, and I think this is probably a topic of conversation. And one thing as well, maybe to Councillor Page's questions, what we've been seeing a couple times anecdotally is some of the newer housing stock that is located in the downtown, people are buying it to, provide they have a parking stall, buying it to use it as a short-term rental because the cost of the units, you can't rent them to cover the cost of your mortgage, so to speak. So the short-term rental is if you're doing it as an investment. So that's why we're kind of thinking that there might be something that we want to look at in terms of the tourist accommodation, where it is not within the hotel, but it was built as a residential product, and then it's being bought as to be used as a short-term rental. So I think the cost of housing, the mortgage rates and all that is kind of pushing things in that direction as well.
Councillor Page, did you?
So
Okay, sorry.
I appreciate that is what's happening on the ground today in the current environment. My question really is as we look at the elements of that decision that leads to the asking price that is asked based on the trends within the market, that other people have gone ahead and bought for that price, and so homeowner or owners, building property owners, expect that they can get an X dollar amount. When we make that even easier by providing these allowable uses that allow for that calculation to go on both the buyer and the seller's side of what could be potential for that property, are we shooting ourselves in the foot, per se, because we are allowing the commodification of rental stock that otherwise would diminish the revenue opportunity of that particular building, and on both sides of the buyer and seller decision, lower the opportunity and therefore lower the asking price of those properties? Because I don't think we live in a world where if it wasn't an opportunity, those properties wouldn't still need to go through a natural cycle of being transferred and moved around and sold. That activity still happens within the breadth of society anyway. Are we helping drive and alleviate pressure on the inflationary side of housing costs by allowing these revenue opportunities that are also impacting our residential market, and therefore justifying larger mortgages in and of themselves?
I think, can I just,
I think Councillor Pinheiro is next. Do you need to?
I was going to put that into a one sentence. Because
And that is welcomed.
And I think what you're saying is that it's a circular argument, that you have a mortgage helper, and I'm going to actually repeat back to you what you said there, Matt, supplementary income to help pay mortgages. So you're saying a mortgage helper, and this is the common definition. And so I think what Keith is trying to get at is that maybe it's time for us to shift if that's what we need to do. So the circular argument is you've got a mortgage helper, but it helps pay your mortgage. Well, that's the definition of a mortgage helper. So if the mortgages were lower, then we wouldn't need the helper. So if we're building things specifically so that and it inflates the prices.
A little bit
That-
more
that's
than
the
one
same.
sentence, and Councillor Pinheiro would now like to add.
Yeah, so those are all good points, and actually, Keith, I like that point. I think in some ways maybe I can have a stab at one sentence, but are we not
You go.
creating the problem by allowing these things, you're allowing people to buy with the expectation that they're going to have this income, and so they're buying at a higher price than they normally would. And so it continues until it's no longer sustainable anymore, which I feel. I have a couple questions about things in that vein. I mean, from what I can tell, both STRs and tourist accommodation, I mean, it's just a zoning difference, right? Both are used by tourists,
Correct.
right? So there's no difference really. It's in the context of who's using them and who isn't. And who isn't using them is people that live here. And so that's a problem as far as the sustainability of our community, the vibrancy of our community, which is one of the things that we've identified as something we want to improve, right? So this is having a negative effect on that exponentially, I would argue. And then just on the numbers here, like there's 30 entire houses, or just over 30 entire houses that have put up for Airbnb, and just under 50 suites. So, around 80 units completely out of the market. And I'm wondering, those houses, like there is a component, they're supposed to be primarily residential, but what is that number? Like, can I stay in my house can I come and, paint the walls for a week once a year, and that satisfies that residential angle, and then the rest of it's essentially a hotel? I'm not sure about that, but it's a curious question. And then my last point for now, I think, or question is, you spoke about, the capacity sort of vis-a-vis growth and development and these things. And it seems like it's working in those capacities, but we've been at a 0 vacancy rate for some time now. So maybe I'm just wondering how that capacity was calculated, and if we're at 0 capacity, then why, or 0 vacancy, sorry, why do we have any capacity for this? We need housing. So why is there any capacity for short-term rentals at all? It's not maybe I should cut it short there. But lastly, I guess, is that, I'm not that old, and I remember when people used to rent out their suites as mortgage helpers, and that was fine. So, yeah, that's a lot. Sorry, piece that out as you will.
Right. Yeah, those are all great points. In terms of the principal residency piece, if you are to rent out your home, it does depend on the number of units that are on the property. So say you have a house with a basement suite. Sometimes we'll see a property owner living in a suite and then they rent out the house. And when there's 2 units on the property, that does satisfy that requirement to have a principal resident on the property. And therefore, yes, you could just paint the walls 1 week each year, and that would satisfy the requirements. So, it is dictated by the number of units. And as for the capacity, I'm not totally sure how the actual the number, the 150 cap, the 110 cap for annual licenses was originally decided when these regulations were put in place, but it was surely established based on demand from the public and what was surely followed best practice, I suppose, for short-term rentals in other cities. What would be appropriate based on neighborhood impact and based on the population size and the number of homes that we have. So I believe that's likely how that capacity was established. Whether or not that capacity is existent today, I suppose, is up for debate, I guess.
I think there's one thing to specify too.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we've, at the very least, we've dealt with in residential zones, so people cannot just buy a house as an investment and just short-term rent it. They need to be the primary residents of that place.
Technically.
Can I
So
ask
Councillor
again?
Romero is gonna do a
we
supplemental,
do,
then
it
Councillor
does,
Page, and then I have a
yeah,
question.
it does come to us that people are kind of wondering, and that's another big piece to this, since we're talking high level, is that we get people wanting to do STRs every day, and they're like, these regulations are crazy, why are you over-regulating this stuff? You know, people don't get the big picture, right? So, you know, a lot of these conversations have happened when these bylaws were initiated. Unfortunately, both Matt and I were not there at the time. So I'm going to guess, like anything in planning, it was some sort of a balanced approach, right? Came up with a cap, and it probably resonated with what was existing. And then there's also, you know, I think these units are being created as well. They might not be short-term rental forever. They, you know, they could be something else eventually, but that's where the cap comes into play, right? That was the number that, working with the council at the time, was seen as the reasonable number. If that needs to change, then we just need the direction to change that. So I think it really boils down to that. I think our regs are good. We're on them every day. But then if there's a question around, this is too much, then tell us. And tell us to relook at it, and then we can do that. But we're just right now working with our regs that were adopted by council at the time.
I'm just going to ask a quick question, and I could have looked this up before, I apologize, but the price for a short-term rental license on an annual basis is how much?
Thanks.
It does depend on the type of unit that you'll be renting. For a suite, for a suite, it would be $1,600 for a year. For a home, it would be $800.
Okay, and for tourist accommodation, I'm interested in the comparison, I guess, is what, are they in the same ballpark? Or is,
A tourist accommodation business license is $160 per year.
It's just a license.
so if I have a business on Baker Street and I turn that into the top into, it's that 160 is included in my business license for my business plus the short-term rental?
No, you would need a separate business license for that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so obviously, economic incentive to do a short-term rental as opposed to a longer-term lease. Pretty clear economic incentive, is there not there? Okay. Councillor Page?
So I would take the opportunity to refer for review the regulations around downtown housing, tourist accommodation, and whether or not it's appropriate to start considering a cap. I would like to hear back from Development Services staff about that. No referring?
No referring. So we can
it's a
take note
workshop,
of
can
that.
we?
And it is a workshop and it is a CAL meeting, so we're not generally pushing it off to staff at this point.
All right.
I think the purpose of today, and I think Matt did a really good job to talk about what it is and what it isn't, where we're at. If, you know, you can take time to digest that information. If you want to give us a call, send us an email to have a bit more one-on-one, we can do that as well. But ideally, if there are some things that, you know, you can't sleep and you're thinking about it, you know, it could be something to talk about for the 2024 work plan, for us to look at that. Because once we reopen this, it's going to be a big community conversation, right? So I just want to, you know, it needs to go through a process, right? Because they're big questions. There's a lot of people involved. If we're starting to cancel business licenses and stuff like that, there's going to be some, there's going to be some bits and pieces that we need to figure out. There's a communication piece to all of this and a greater engagement. So, I guess today is just really information. And then if there's something that you want to think about, that we can look at maybe on next year's work plan, I think that would be something to flag at some point in time.
Okay, so if I can finish up, thank you. I appreciate that. I have no problem putting it in the parking lot we used to have for those conversations. If we can bring that back in the parking lot. I did want to cover a couple things that I heard today that I think are interesting to go look at addressing some of the pressures we're seeing out there in the community. So the capping the downtown tourist accommodations through a change in the business license use makes sense to me to have a good look at and understand the pros and cons of that. The price point makes sense to me. At 2% of our building stock, are these numbers even appropriate? We see within the cannabis component of our business license, we have quite high rates to get compliance under the justification that we need additional safety investments in our public services and our police department in order to maintain those kinds of businesses. These are having an impact on 2% of our housing stock. What is the cost of our activity to remediate that impact? Are these license fees appropriate given the impact they're having on the overall housing stock? Maybe they're not. And is the balance to promote them and make them affordable, or is the balance to have them be effective? So I would like to look at the pricing and understand, is there something we should be doing there further? And I think we've been talking about looking at that, but that component of the MRDT, like, is that something we're getting ready to ask for? Are we looking for when we're funding the other side of this equation, the affordable component? And then I know both directly and anecdotally that the residential primary compliance piece might not be is not as effective as maybe we think it is. There are certainly cases of within 100, it might be only 2, 3, 4%. It might be higher. But how beyond host compliance are we ensuring that the residential primary component is actually being used and not someone having one room in a building that they might come to once in a while when they visit Nelson, and the rest of the time, the rest of the house is all Airbnb, which is that really what we're looking for when we're talking about residential primary compliance? I assume we expect it to be someone who lives there primarily and also rents it out. But is it are people finding ways around that? And should we look closer at, especially these single unit housing situations, and say, how can we better understand if this is actually your primary residence in this country?
Filling up the parking lot. Anything else for the parking lot?
Well, I just wanted to
Yep, nope.
describe what was in the parking
Got it there.
lot. So,
Was that a clear communication? Is there,
Yeah, just supplementally, I think that's a great point about, the sort of, I wouldn't say the roadblocks, but the hoops that we make, a cannabis store jump through because of the perceived knock-on effects of that business license, right? There's police and there's all of these things that we perceive is going to be increased by the existence of that entity. And the non-existence of housing in this community, I would argue, you want to talk policing, you want to talk emergency services, you want to talk mental health, you want to talk addictions, like the knock-on effects of not having a place to live blows a cannabis store out of the water. And I think we need to look at it with that context, is that it's an emergency and that these licenses are, I don't want to demonize people that have Airbnbs. It's clearly not their intent, is to cause homelessness and addiction. That's not why they're doing it. However, the realities are what they are, and I think council needs to take that into account, as our position is we have this sober sort of overview of what's going on, and we're not locked into a mortgage that we can't afford, and we're not struggling to make ends meet in the same way. It's not immediate for us. We have the luxury of seeing the big picture, and that, unfortunately, to me, is the big picture. That these STRs in this tourist accommodation is directly causing a lot of the other social problems and lack of cohesion in the community. So I would just like us to give it that gravity. It's not as simple as, keeping up with growth or, this capacity, that capacity. I think it's actually a very serious issue, and has knock-on effects. And while, anecdotally, I can say that there's a lot of empty houses in this community that are used as Airbnbs and nobody ever lives there. I know quite a few of them. So whether that's enforcement or a change of the rules, and these are the rules as they exist, and we may be doing a great job of enforcing the rules as they exist, but I think maybe we need to change the rules because it's persistent. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And I would give it the same lens, right? If we're looking at we're not just looking at the thing, we're looking at the things that thing causes, and the lack of a place to live certainly causes a fair amount of things, you know.
Yeah, it's a big piece in a complex puzzle.
My last comment is, last summer I went with my family to Canmore, and I have never, I mean, just in relationship to how controlled it is here. I mean, it blew me away in Canmore. I mean, they're building whole new, brand new, 50-unit structures that are specifically designed for people to invest in short-term rental. They're purchasing a unit that goes into a pool. They never live there. It's just a place to park money and make money. I felt like a totally naive, country bumpkin person coming there and seeing this. I had no idea that it was on that scale, and there were huge parts of that town which are just that, row upon row upon row of 50-unit structures. Now it's a completely different world. It's servicing Calgary and lots of big populations, but we're a long way from that, and I do feel like we do have to also factor into the knock-on effects that we are a tourist town that doesn't have a lot of homegrown or big industry like Castlegar has their industry, and Tekis and Trail. So we don't have a lot of that. So there has to be this incredible variety in our town to make it. So I think there's a balance like in everything, and we just have to consider that people are trying to make it here, and this is one way that they add to their income, and also service our quite large tourist population. So I'm not trying to totally get what you're saying, and there's definitely knockoff effects that are causing negative problems, but we also have to consider that there's the other sides to it too. So, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think we've given
Yeah.
development services lots to think about. And as you said, Sebastian, if anyone has any burning questions that come up later, they're always available to assist us with that. When Councillor Woodward was talking about that, am I the only person in the room who knows what a timeshare is? Because that's what I was thinking about. Is that what they're doing in Canmore? Or have they just rebranded that? Because
Well, in some communities, they actually just say that you're not allowed to Airbnb or short-term rental anything other than a room in a building, right? You don't get to do units. You get to do
Okay.
rooms.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for the
you.
presentation. Thanks for the information, and just always being there when we need you.
Thank you.
Next. Where are we going next? Oh, I understand that even though the city manager officially is not here, there may be reports coming from Chief Financial Officer, and I still can't say your full title altogether. Chris.
GM.
GM. Okay, General Manager.
Nothing specific from the CAO at this time, but I did have some things if Mr. Cormack was here, I was going to add, so I'll just go with what I had. Couple of things. One, we talked last time about UMO, which I don't know what this stands for. U-Mobile, something like that.
Transit app?
Yeah. We will be having those BC Transit come, I think in September, to do a little presentation, and I did get an update from them that UMO, the target date for rolling that out in West Kootenays will be in January of 2024. So just a little update of when we might see that, and that's still a bit tentative, but that's kind of where we're at. They're doing a staged approach across the province in different areas first, and that's kind of where we're slotted in to get that product. Another piece is we have a retirement in Public Works that's happening, one of our arborists. And so in order to ensure that we're kind of pulling on that information that, has been accumulated over the years, we will need to bring somebody in to ahead of that retirement, which means for a period of a few months here, we'll have kind of a doubling up of that resource. the public works budget's tight. So we talked about this during our budgeting process. We didn't add any, there's no fat on the budget. We kept things pretty lean. So in doing that, it does put some pressure on the public works operating budget, and I'm hopeful that we can, accommodate that within the budget, but there's potential that as we get to the end of the year, as things come up and we do that financial plan amendment, we may need to add in a piece. I'm guessing, $30,000 to $40,000 to kind of cover up that doubling up of that resource. Then I would bring that to you later on in the year, but I think it's something we should and need to do in order to kind of keep that consistency and have succession planning and just part of business and letting folks kind of move on with their lives, and also being able to have business continuity. So that's kind of where we're at. If you see something get posted out there, we're not adding a permanent extra resource, we're just bringing something in early to kind of cover that up until that retirement happens.
And if I may just add to that, maybe a little bit of additional detail. So all of our employees in Public Works, after a career here, they have a whole bunch of information that they can pass down, which is what we're intending to do here. This one particular person, this idea of bringing someone in to train under the other person for an amount of time isn't necessarily in every position thing that we do, though. This one is very unique. This person has some knowledge that only they carry. So while we're hoping to bring someone in to be able to get a lot of that information passed down, or however that those sort of chips fall, maybe someone bumps up and then we bring someone to fill that in. At the same time, I can tell you that our director of municipal operations is also paying attention to learning a few of the tricks that this person has learned over their 20-year career. So just wanted to make the point that this isn't something that we do with every retirement at Public Works or in positions. It's just sometimes you come about certain individuals that have a skill set unto themselves, and that needs to be passed on to someone.
Yeah, that's all that I had. I don't know if, Chris, you had anything in addition you wanted to? No? Okay.
Generational knowledge, very important to pass down, especially as things are changing around us. Okay, what's next? Council reports. What do we got? Councillor Woodward.
Well, along with Councillor Payne, we both were at the Siniacs canoe launch.
Canoe journey.
Or canoe journey.
Nelson
Part of
stop.
They've
Yep.
been, it's been 7 days.
Journeying from Revelstoke.
From Revelstoke. And so they were launching at the end of the airport to go across and look at the hieroglyphs.
The pictographs.
The pictographs on the wall there. Sorry, not pictographs. And it was a wonderful experience. There must have been, I don't know, over 100 people there. It was pouring rain, but people showed up, and they had the big dugout canoes, and I just felt like it was a real community event and community celebration. And there was a lot of good feelings and laughs, and trying to manage the weather was pretty hectic, and then it calmed down just before all the canoes went out. So that was really positive. But yeah, that was a really good kind of heartwarming community experience that I went to.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? What have you folks been up to? Okay.
Okay, I'll give a few of my updates. So we had the regional district board meeting last Thursday. Amongst the normal stuff, the RDCK has put forward a motion that it'll be lifting the water services moratorium in 2024 with the expectation that policies and bylaws and basically any of the bureaucracy that we might want to have in place to then consider water systems being brought into the RDCK will be presented before that date. So that was one thing that had gone through. We had accepted a number of normal run-of-the-mill contracts, and basically it was a pretty run-of-the-mill meeting, other than that, because that's been floating around for a while.
Business was done.
Otherwise, I would leave it maybe to some of the others that were able to attend, but Development Services did an excellent tour of the new building construction that's going on around town. Many on council and around this table were able to jump on a bike and participate in that and get a hands-on understanding of what built structures are coming into the community. We also had Greater Nelson and area elected officials presentation on the greater housing entity that we received a report from a couple months ago now from Macola, and got a little bit more in depth into what we see in terms of opportunities to do or not do that kind of entity. Some of us were there, not everyone had an opportunity to get there, but I know the economic development table, which I might leave to Kate, also touched on that. So I think those are the biggest things coming out of the last 2 weeks.
Can I just add to that I thought was really great with the housing workshop was the regional aspect. Because there was us councillors around the table, but there was also lots of directors, area directors and staff and
The mayor of Castlegar.
the mayor of Castlegar.
Didn't we have Nakusp and?
Mayor of Caslow.
Mayor of Caslow, Cusp.
So there was really kind of that.
You
Came in.
had areas directors. RDCK was invited.
Yeah. So it was nice to see that kind of regional approach rather than just in the city. So,
Makes us stronger all around.
yeah.
Anything else? Councillor Tate? No?
What am I forgetting about recognition? You go ahead. No. It was pretty, recognition was run of the mill. We didn't, nothing comes to mind.
Okay, well, we're coming in just about right on time for dinner, so I'll make mine really quick. It has been an extremely busy couple of weeks out there. In addition to the Cenax stop here on their canoe journey, which, as Councillor Woodward said, it was an amazing experience to be out on the water with those boats, you can't say canoe, it just doesn't sound right, but there was a flotilla that accompanied them across, and it was a very different experience than just going across and seeing it on your own. And then they after cooking salmon in pits down at Lakeside Park in the sand, they took that up, and there was a full community lunch that was well attended, with lots of opportunities for learning, understanding, listening to panels. Brittany Anderson was there to speak on a panel, and the mayor also presented at a panel. So I think a really incredible opportunity for our community just to learn more about where we live, what our place is, and the belongingness of all peoples that are here. The weekend before that, also a huge event. I know it was Cavalcade, but I went to the Columbia Basin Trust Symposia, which was in Trail, and we probably could have loaded up a bus from Nelson to go there. So Nelson was well represented in all areas, arts and culture, business, and Columbia Basin Trust, as usual, does an excellent job of community engagement. There were lots of opportunities to add to what the direction could be. And I think one of the most interesting things for me was they asked whether going forward they should focus on one big area or continue to be involved in a variety of sectors around the basin. So that gendered a lot of conversation. They didn't suggest what that area was. Different tables came up with things like housing, transportation, climate, all of the culture, all of those sorts of things. But it was interesting how they're looking at possibly doing a shift from the way they've traditionally done business. I'll just add one more thing, and just a small thing, but the Cultural Development Committee juries the art that hangs in City Hall, and my understanding is that it was switched today.
It's in
It's in progress. So these are local artists who have the opportunity for the next year to have their work being shown here. you might not traditionally think of City Hall as an art gallery, but it is a wonderful opportunity to come and, support local artists, and that sort of leads into Friday night when we'll have the opportunity for two incredible events. I don't know how people can ever say that there's nothing to do in Nelson, because Art Walk is Friday night. It is spreading, it is going deeper, it is going broader. There's something for everyone, all ages. And then I'm going to say this incorrectly, so I won't say the name, but the Civic with Leslie Garlow, who's Indigenous Education over at the Nelson Museum, and I probably have her title incorrect, have curated an amazing film festival this weekend of what the progression of how Indigenous artists and themes show up in film and have done for quite some time. So there's some spectacular films coming to our small town, which just always sort of blows me away. Did a few other things, but probably talk about them later. And time for us to break for lunch. Do we adjourn from this, or we just? We do a temporary recess.
Temporary adjournment.
A temporary adjournment, and we are seconded, and is anybody gonna oppose that one, or should we just go for it? We're good. Thanks. Come back. We'll be here.
We didn't do anything.
It was before the last meeting.
Was it? Wasn't there something more recently than that?
We had one on the 6th.
We
had a council on the 6th, then we had a meeting on like the 1st.
Oh, I know why it's on the top of my mind, because I was